Hello friends, I'm back another Sunday night with Spooky Ms. T.I. I'm all by myself back in my original spot. It's been like 3 weeks or so since I've been back in this spot. Last week, when Rachel and I told the story together, we went upstairs and set up at my altar. That was pretty cool. I almost considered doing that again tonight, but this setup is just a little bit more comfortable. I have to turn off the fan up there when I'm doing these, and it gets kind of stifling. It's been hot here today. It's been a steamy day around here. Humid, hot. You know, when you get a cloudburst thunderstorm, and then as it just evaporates into the air, it makes it the kind of day where you could pretty much stick the baby to the wall. You know what I'm talking about? So I had to do a quick shift because I had planned a really special thing that you're gonna have to wait till next week for. I'm sorry, but it isn't like I'm short on stories. So I'm going to be doing some more stories from the place where I grew up and the place that molded me, that made me this person that knows spooks. So I have this, I don't know if you can see this. I'm gonna hold this up. See this candle here? I inherited this from my sister-in-law, Sarah. If you look at it, it's got a votive inside, and then it's women. It looks like it's women all sitting around the fire, all with these wonderful protruding tukuses. I can really relate. It reminds me of myself and my sisters, and when we all get together, we all come round like this and kind of connect. See how all the people are connected? Not just my birth sisters, but all the sisters and brothers who've come to me throughout this life and probably more. And I think it kind of symbolizes all of us as we kind of scoot in close and light our candles and pour our libation and begin another night of stories that make us think about things beyond ourselves. So tonight I'm going to tell, I know I told some stories about the house on Pensacola Avenue in Chicago. I hope I don't repeat. I called up Rachel and said, which ones did I tell? Because there are so many, because I don't want to bore you with repetition. But I think I've got a few that I could put together that you haven't heard yet here. So here, those of you who know me may have heard these before this. And of course, family members lived through some of these stories. So I'm going to start when I was just school age, maybe 6 years old. And, oh, cheers. Here's to another Sunday in a global pandemic. I know there's a lot more movement, but I hope you're all wearing your masks and still be safe. I can't believe they're talking about schools starting with the numbers the way they are. It's crazy, but here we are. Here's to surviving together, because that's the only way you do survive, am I right? Okay, now on to the story. I was about 6 years old because when I was school-aged, when I was real little, all my siblings and I shared one big bedroom up in the front of the house. And then when we got older, my sister Kate and I got to get our own room with just the two of us, which was like heaven. Now, this room was really odd. When you came up the stairs, there was a small room right at the head of the stairs, and then you had to turn to go around the hallway that then faced the bathroom and the big bedroom. But then to the left there, as you're facing the bathroom, there was this little short alcove, like hallway kind of thing, very strange. So it pushed that room back as wide as the little room at the head of the stairs went. So it had this very closed, dark space before you got to the bedroom door. And at one point, there was a door on each side. And that just kind of terrified me. I was really glad that door had been removed, but to be stuck between those places. The odd thing about this room is that well, let me describe it for you, okay? It had one bed, one double bed that my sister and I shared. Smaller room, and it was in the back of the house where the eave came down. I'm gonna move this over so I don't keep shadowing my face as I move my hands. Where the eave came down at the head of our bed, and up in the eave were these narrow windows. So when you were standing in the room, you could not see out of those windows except up to the tree limbs and the sky above. But then when you were in the bed, as you walked in the door, directly in front of you, there was a large window very close to the floor, only about maybe a foot off of the floor, a great big window. And that looked across to Aunt Bernice and Uncle Irv's house, our neighbors next door. They weren't really relatives, but we called them Aunt Bernice and Uncle Irv because we adopted them. And there was a street light out there. And then there was a closet door. And the closet was kind of unusual too, because it was a shared closet with that front bedroom, meaning that when you opened the door to the closet in Kate's and my room, you could, if you dared, slip through that closet and open the door on the other side of it and enter into the master bedroom, the big L-shaped bedroom. And this was it was strange to have a shared closet like that. I'd never seen anything quite like that before or since, but that was how it was made. And that closet was terrifying. That closet, I know closets are creepy, and that's a total cliche that closets are creepy, but I gotta tell you, this closet was exceptionally creepy, so much so that when we had to put our clothes away, my mother did laundry, and she did, in those days, little girls at school, you had to wear a dress, and these were not wash and wear dresses. These were like cotton dresses that had to be ironed and starched when they came out of the wash. The boys' pants had to be pressed, shirts had to be pressed. Laundry was a huge task. And when I was that age, we only had a washing machine. And that was in the basement, which was another fun place. But the washing machine, my mother would wash the clothes and then bring them up and put them on a line at my grandmother's house next door when the weather was forgiving enough. But in the winter, or when the weather was inclement, she would hang those clothes all over the house, like hangers from the dining room chandelier, from the backs of chairs, from the tops of door jambs. You had to be careful, because if you knocked down those clean clothes, you'd get a swat with that 8-foot cane fishing pole, which was not pleasant. So these clothes would be drying, and then my mother would stand in the dining room for, I kid you not, hours with that iron and that bottle of starch, ironing everybody's clothes. She also, most of the men who worked sent their shirts out to be done, but my mother was so expert at ironing that she even did my father's white dress shirts. And that was not, because if you got even a little crease in it, it wouldn't come out. You'd have to re-wet the whole thing. You'd have to start from scratch. And she got really good at this. But because this was such a arduous chore, our job, when our laundry was done, would be to take it upstairs and put it away immediately. All our dresses needed to be hung up in that closet. And the way it was is that when you open the closet door, inside of it, there was a bar that went sideways, I think. You had to step all the way into the closet to hang up the dresses. And they weren't on hangers. She would drape them on a chair. We had to take them upstairs and put them on the hangers, and then put them in the closet. And all of our other clean clothes, we had to make sure they were folded and neatly put in our dresser drawers. We had a laundry hamper in our room, and I remember my sister once not wanting to put away her clothes and putting it on the laundry hamper, and she got a whack for every single item of clean clothing in that laundry basket. And it was not 5 nor 10, it was quite a few more. So I learned from other people. I was not that person that had to do it myself to learn. I watched that and was very careful about putting my clothes away. But the other thing is that we would not be alone in the house. That just was not an option, day or night. It was not okay. But upstairs, especially, or to put clothes in the closet, no way. Here's how we did it. So Kate and I would go up together, and one would carry the dresses very carefully, and the other would carry the clothes for the drawer. We'd set it all on the bed. And then we would do eeny, meeny, miny, mo to see who would open the closet door and who would step in to grab the hangers. And Kate, being a couple years older than me, it was amazing. I always seemed to lose the eeny, meeny, miny, mo. I wonder if she knew how that worked. Anyway, when we opened the door, I would say, okay, open that door, and that person would stand in that door so it couldn't accidentally swing closed while you were in there. And I would take a deep breath, and I would jump in that closet, and I would look for all of the empty hangers, and sometimes you'd have to go through things and find the empty hangers and pull out the empty hangers, and we'd climb out and slam the door shut while we put the dresses on the hangers. And then again, we would do the eeny, meeny, miny, mo, which I would lose. And again, we'd open that closet door, and Kate would hold the dresses, and I would go inside, and I'd tell her to hand them to me carefully, because if they fell off the hanger, you'd have to have that door open longer and be in there longer. So we were super careful, and we hung all those dresses, and the minute we were done, we'd slam that door, and then we'd make a beeline for the stairwell and to get downstairs, running down those stairs, holding on tight to that railing, and just flying down to get out of there after hanging up our clothes. And this was just, normal obsessive compulsive behavior in the Shippers household when I was a child. The other thing that we did is when we would go to bed, we would leave the door open, and we put something in front of the door so that the door wouldn't close. This is the door of the hall, because the hall light would always be on. And we'd always block it so that it couldn't accidentally swing closed. You didn't want the door closed. You wanted that light. Plus, there was the light from the street light out in on the street, so that helped. So it was never super dark there. But before we got to bed, we would close that closet door. You'd open it, and it would click, and then it had this ornate, carved brass door handle, like from the Victorian door handles. Really beautiful thing. Wonder what happened to that. But we'd open the door and slam it shut, and then tug on it to make sure that the latch hooked, and gravity wouldn't make it go and open up. And then we'd get in bed, and as soon as we'd get in bed, we'd say, "Did you check the closet door?" I would say, "Yeah, we checked the closet. We better check it again." And one or both of us, we would do this 3 or 4 times a night, and before getting in bed. And like I say, just normal, seemingly obsessive compulsive behavior that was actually intended to try to keep us safe in that place. And then we get in bed, and we'd scoot to the very middle of the bed. In that room especially, but really any place in the house, there were things that would touch you, and you could feel breath on you, or fingers, if your hands were out. So we'd get in the bed, and we'd pull the covers up, like over our ears, and just, chin, so that just our mouth and nose was exposed so that we could breathe. If it was hot, we'd just pull the sheet up anyway. But covers up, hands tucked under the pillow or tucked in the covers. If your hands were out, somebody would try to grab your hand. We would lay back to back in the middle of that bed, and we'd tuck everything in. And then, in order to not be the last one awake, we actually tried to synchronize our falling asleep. And we would slow our breathing and kind of whisper the word sleep, sleep, all all tucked under so no one would touch our hands. If your back was turned to the outside of the bed, you would feel these really cold, like fingers moving up your back. Oh, I get shivers just even thinking about it. That only happened a couple of times, but we would tuck in and get safe in there. And as we were falling asleep, we'd say, is that closet door closed? Yep, you checked it? I checked it too. Okay, sleep, sleep. And we would drift off to sleep listening to the other and pretty much fall asleep about the same time as the other did each night. And then hopefully sleep all night. Well, I remember the first time I didn't sleep all night. And I woke up and I had no idea what time it was. There was no clock in the room. There was no way of knowing. Like I said, I'm like 6 years old. And I woke up and I was kind of laying on my back. So I had moved in my sleep. Everything was still tucked in. So I was kind of safe, I felt. But I listened, hoping it wasn't too late, and that maybe my parents were still up. So I listened really closely to hear the television. And I couldn't hear the television. And then I listened even more closely to see if I could hear their quiet voices. Their room was downstairs at the end of the hall. And sometimes they would lay in bed and talk, and I'd listen. And I couldn't hear that. And I couldn't even hear any traffic out on Montrose Avenue, which was the busy street across the alley and through the other houses. And Montrose Avenue was a busy street unless it was the wee hours. So I just assumed it was very late. I was the only one in the house, the only one awake, but not the only one there. And when I realized everyone else was asleep, I could just feel the energy of something right there. I could feel something moving in close, watching somehow. But I decided I'm going to just do all of the tricks that my mom taught me to go back to sleep. And I looked, the light that came in from the window, it was, everything seemed so dark. And even that small bit of light, I don't know if the hall light was still on, because I didn't get light coming in from that side of the room, but it was coming in from the low window near the floor, and I kind of looked out that window. I didn't want to turn over because I didn't want to move too much, because if there was something there, I did not want it to know that I was awake. So I scrunched my eyes closed, almost close. You could see, those kids when they play the games where close your eyes and they're all looking through their eyelashes like this. So I kind of did that, looking out the window. And I tried one of the other tricks my mom taught us. And this was, I pretended that I was a bag of sand and with a hole at the top of my head, and the sand was draining out. And so I started by relaxing my toes and my feet, and imagine the sand just draining out as it went up my body. And I started to drift off and close my eyes, but something kept startling me awake, like, stay alert, stay alert, something is happening. And then I thought, okay, I'm going to get a focal point. Now, I didn't know it was called a focal point, but the light from the street light was reflecting on that brass doorknob. And at that point, I think I may have needed glasses by then, but I could still see pretty well. And I saw that light there, and so I focused on that light as I relaxed my body and felt the sand leave my body. And as I was looking at that light, it appeared as though the doorknob started to turn, just so slowly. More slowly than just so slowly that I said to myself, that's not really moving, it's just my imagination. My eyes are playing tricks on me. And I watched it until I heard the click of the latch. And I could barely breathe. I looked away, just moving my eyes. I looked over at the window, and then I would look up and around the ceiling and over to the other door, and then up and around, trying not to look at the closet door, knowing something was going on. I could hear it moving. I could hear the of it just moving, and I knew the door was opening, but I wasn't going to look at it. And then out of the corner of my eye, as I was looking out the window and trying not to see what was happening, I saw that the door was open about maybe a foot, about this much, about a foot, a little more than a foot, 18 inches maybe. And I couldn't move. I was terrified. I knew someone was in there. I knew that he was there, and he saw me. And I could feel him there before I could see him. And I kind of kept my eyes closed. I knew that my only defense was to pretend I was asleep, because maybe if I was asleep, he wouldn't say anything to me, or even show himself fully to me, or touch me, or anything. And I could just pretend to be asleep and be like invisible. That was it. I was willing myself invisible when I saw him begin to manifest in the closet. And it started with his face. And his face was drawn and anguished. Just anguished. And he was standing there and he was wringing his hands in front of him with this horribly sorrowful expression on his face. And I looked at him, and it was the strangest thing. I didn't feel fear. All of a sudden, all I felt was this immense, devastating sorrow. Now, I'd been sad. I knew sadness. I knew lots of different emotions. I'd seen rage, I'd felt anger. I had a big toolbox of emotions I had known and understood by my young age. And yet this was something I had never felt before. It was a hopelessness. It was a terrible, terrible, desperate hopelessness that I felt coming from this man, and I was feeling it. And as I felt this, tears just started falling from my eyes. It wasn't like, when you're a little kid and you cry and it's like, no, I couldn't move. These desperately sad tears just dripped out of the corners of my eyes into my ears and my pillow, and I still couldn't move. And I stood there watching him as he looked at me, and I felt his unbearable pain. And I felt no fear of him. I felt nothing but pity and empathy for this guy. I was just a little kid, and here is this man suffering so much in front of me, and I just felt it with him. And all I could feel was like, I didn't feel like I wanted to help him. I didn't feel like I could help him. I just felt so sad and helpless myself and hopeless myself. And mercifully, after some time, I guess I fell back to sleep. And when I woke up in the morning, I was lying on my side and Kate was still sleeping, and I just kind of, I could hear the birds outside, and as I opened my eyes, I saw it was light, and I was like, oh, phew, that was a terrible dream. What was that dream all about? Ooh, I didn't like that dream. And I, squinched my eyes, and I turned over, and Kate's still sound asleep next to me and just starting to stir, and when I turned over, I sat up in bed and I looked at the closet door that was still open, about 18 inches. And I realized that I had not dreamed that I had actually met that man. When Kate woke up, she said, "What did you open the closet door for?" And I told her I didn't open that door. She kind of looked at me like, yeah, right. That man emanated so much sorrow and so much hopeless grief. It was horrible. Anyway, I saw him multiple times. He came to me multiple times. I started to become a restless sleeper, and I would wake up in the night and I would know he was going to be there. And it got to a point where although I kind of dreaded it when I would wake up and know he was going to be there, I knew I was not in danger. And I started to get to a place where I could almost, I couldn't not feel what he was feeling, but I could separate myself a little from what he was feeling and realize that I wasn't feeling that sad, that it was him. And he was trying to express his sorrow the only way he could, by sharing his emotion with me. And I think that's one of the ways that I learned how to connect with spirits, is those nights alone and awake, until I learned how to leave. That'll be another story, talking about my astral traveling, my spirit travel. But there's I gotta take a breath after that. So it's funny, even now, just remembering that, I remember that hopelessness. I have never felt that myself in my own life. I thank my lucky stars. But I know that feeling. And I can conjure it. It's visceral. It's something in my emotional toolbox now. And I recognize it in others sometimes. I've recognized it in spirits, and I've recognized that in people who are living as well. And they need you to reach out to them. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about our basement, to go from sad to horrible. As I said, my mom, the laundry, the clothes washer, the washing machine was in the basement. My dad had a tool bench in the basement. The basement was a really terrible place. It was, it had a door in the hallway, in the downstairs. The upstairs stairs went up, and then there was this hallway with a wall between the dining room and the living room. And then at the end of that hall was a bedroom where my folks lived. And then there was a basement door. And the basement door opened up toward the basement. So if you were coming up the stairs and somebody opened that, they'd take you right out. But it opened toward the basement, and there were these rickety wooden stairs open underneath with a railing that was really wobbly. And as you went down the stairs, to your right, there was a coal bin. And the coal bin was empty, but in the olden days, it was used for coal. And then when you went past the coal bin and turned to your left, there was a big, giant, I don't know if it was oil or gas. It used to be a coal furnace, but it was converted into a different fossil fuel. when I was a kid, but it was this monstrosity of a furnace. And then the washing machine was against the other wall. And then my dad had a tool bench all the way at the back of the basement, towards the backyard, that was under a bank of windows. And there was a door next to that that did a few steps up and went right outside. And my dad, as I said, he had a tool bench there where all his tools were. Of course, he never worked there. He just kept his tools there, and he never went down the basement stairs from the house to go get his tools. He would always go out the back porch and down the back stairs and through the outside and in through the outside door to get his tools, so he didn't have to go all the way through that basement. There were some other weird things that would happen in that basement. One of the things that happened is there was a place on the basement wall that seemed to be crumbling, and the tuck pointing between the bricks was like decayed, and it was just this one spot, and it was near the furnace, but it wasn't like directly behind the furnace where you would expect if there was a heat anomaly or something that could cause the wall to weather differently. It was a little bit a ways from that, and bricks were often falling out. It was a brick wall, a rough cement floor on the foundation. The foundation was brick, and so we used to play this game. My childhood was just very weird, and we all hated the basement. The basement was scary as hell, and there was something just terrible in that basement. And the minute you entered the basement, you could feel it. So we had this really fun game that we played in the summertime, where we would stand outside the basement door in the backyard, the side yard by the driveway. The driveway was all black cinders left over from the Chicago fire. And the bricks inside were fire bricks from the Chicago fire, where they were salvaged from buildings after the Chicago fire. Because the house was built shortly after the fire. It was built by these brothers whose last name was Davidson. And then they sold it, or their lawyer sold it, their estate sold it to my great-grandma, who gifted it to my great-grandma and her husband as a wedding gift. And then we rented the place for my great-grandmother. I know I may have said that in the other stories about the Pensacola house, but I think there may be some people that are just joining, and so I want to give a little backstory with that. So the house had been in the family for generations, but before my family lived there, another family lived there. So the game that we played would be, we would all stand outside the basement door. And remember the rule about never being alone? Well, that rule was thrown to the wolves for this game, because this game consisted of each of us taking turns and stepping down those 3 or 4 steps into the basement, and the rest of the kids outside slamming the basement door shut and starting to count. 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, 4, 1,000, counting, and you would stand in there and try to see how long you could stand there before you screamed, "Let me out, let me out." And the minute you said, "Let me out," the rule was they would fling the door open and you go running out of there, breathless and terrified and sweating and freaked out. And I was pretty good at that game, because the way that you played, the way that I could stay for like 30 seconds sometimes, because the trick was that you'd stand close to the basement door, to the outside door, and try to maintain a connection. Sometimes I would even touch that door so that I felt like I had some kind of connection to my siblings waiting outside to open the door. And I would stand there listening to them count, and I would not look to my left or to my right. I would look only at the door, and to stand there until you could feel it coming closer and closer and closer and closer and closer. And when it was almost close enough to touch you, that's when I would scream, "Open the door, open the door." And they'd fling the door open, and I'd go tumbling out and fall onto the floor, and we'd all laugh and roll on the floor because of the adrenaline rush. We were all little shippers adrenaline junkies. And then it was somebody else's turn. Now, and we would do this for fun and for the adrenaline rush. Well, there was a kid who lived at the end of the block. Now, our neighborhood was filled with children. This was the, like 1960, early 60s, if that, and if beyond that. And it was the baby boom. You know what I'm talking about? Every family had 5 or more kids. Every family was this huge family, but at the end of the block lived a boy named Jimmy who lived alone with his mother and his Italian grandmother. And his mother and grandmother, his grandmother, only spoke Italian. And she would always speak Italian to him, and his mother spoke Italian to the grandmother and would speak Italian to Jimmy. And Jimmy was kind of, he was kind of a sheltered child, and we were the wild adrenaline junkies down the block, but he loved us, and we would play together. And we'd go down and we'd stand. You never rang a doorbell when I was a kid. You would go and you would stand outside and all chant together, "Yo, Jimmy, can you come out to play?" And we'd wait. And then we'd hear this kerfuffle inside in Italian. And pretty soon Jimmy would come skipping up the garden. They lived in the garden apartment, 3-flat. And he'd come down and he would stand and watch us play this game with just this look of horror on his face, because, we told him about how scary the basement was, and there were monsters that lived in the basement, and we were not very nice. It was true. There were monsters that dwelt in the basement. So this one summer afternoon, Jimmy was there with us, and we started to ask him if he wanted a turn. And he was like, no, I don't want to have a turn. I don't want to go down in that basement. We're like, don't be a baby. You could go down there. Remember, the minute you say, "Let me out," we'll open the door. Don't worry. You're not going to get hurt or anything. It's not, and the windows are right there. It's light. It's not dark, He's like, no, I don't want to do it. And we just coaxed him and talked him into it. And he's finally agreed to go down in the basement. And I have to tell you, children can be very cruel. And this was a time that made a huge impact on me. I saw that cruelness in some of my siblings' faces, when he went down there. He was easy, he was easy. And he agreed to go down into the basement. And I wasn't sure at this point, although I was in on helping persuade him to go. "We'll open the door right away," I said. "We'll open the door." And he said, "Oh, okay, you promise?" And we, "Yeah, that's the deal. We'll open the door." So he went down those steps, and I remember, I can picture him standing there in his shorts, and he had long shorts that were down to his knees, and he was a little bit pudgy, and he was standing there looking up at us with these big, brown, trusting eyes. And as my brother and sister laughed and slammed the door, and the minute the door closed, he screamed, "Open the door, open the door!" And they didn't. And they held the door closed. And I was standing behind them, and I didn't quite know what to do. And then he starts to cry. And I hear him calling for his mama. And then I'm like, "Open the door, I was saying from behind them. And they're laughing and holding the door closed. And finally he went silent, and that was it. I pushed my sister down. She fell on her butt. This was not my big sister. She never played this game. She wasn't stupid like we were. But I pushed my sister down and pulled my brother off and opened that door. And here's Jimmy on the basement floor. He's got his arms around himself, and he's huddled down and rocking back and forth, whimpering. And oh my God, I ran. I didn't even hit a step. I jumped down there, with my fist balled up, looking around that basement if anything was there. And I said, "Come on, Jimmy." And I put my hands on him and said, "Get up, come on out." And he started saying, "I want to go home, I want to go home." And I helped lift him up. And as we got up out those stairs, I looked, and it looked like my sister and my brother were going to laugh or do something, and I shot them this look. And I said, you do anything and I'm telling Mommy. And then they would get a licking, and that would be the end of it. But I told Jimmy, don't go home, it's okay. We'll go over to Grandma's house. She lived next door, and maybe play in her apple tree or her cherry tree. She had a cherry tree, and if she didn't see us, we could climb the tree. She never liked us to climb the tree because she said we'd ruin the tree. I think she was actually worried we'd get hurt, but she didn't like to show affection, so she told us we'd ruin the tree. I've never done anything that cruel again in my life, and I never will. And I recognize that cruelty, and I've recognized that cruelty a little bit in children, not for the 40 years that I taught, and I was able to head it off as an adult, but as a child I participated. We all participate in things that we regret, I'm sure. Maybe not. Maybe some of you are more saintly than I, but I grew up in a house of adrenaline junkies and spirits. There was one time that I had to go into the basement alone from the upstairs dining room stairs. And it was cold. It was maybe November. So my mom was doing laundry, and she was hanging the stuff all up in the dining room, and everybody else had gone out to play except the baby, and I was hanging out with my mom because I like to do that. And we used to, when she would do the laundry, she would load up this basket. She'd unload the washing machine and fill this basket with this heavy wet laundry, and then just precariously have to schlep it up those steps into the dining room, where she would shake everything out and then hang it up. And we would sit at the top of the steps with the door open, talking to her while she was down there. And she was amazing. She was so fast. She could unload and reload that washing machine in 5 minutes and then come up. And I remember this one, I think it was late fall, cold outside, but not snow yet, so I didn't go out to play. And she was pregnant. Let's see, who would that have been? I don't know. One of the spring babies. But she was carrying this basket up and came in, and then when she got upstairs, we would slam the door shut, and it had one of those hook and eye hooks that was up high so that the little ones couldn't reach it, because God forbid the little ones open that door and go tumbling down those rickety stairs into that basement. So we slammed the door and put the latch in, and my mom puts the basket up on the dining room table. And back in those days, the doctors told you to stick to only 3 or 4 cigarettes a day when you were pregnant, and only 2 cocktails a day when you were pregnant. Maybe that's why we were adrenaline junkies. Anyway, so my mother smoked Herbert Terrytons. And after she got the laundry all hung up, she was standing there, and she took out her pack of cigarettes, and then she looked for her matches. And she said the word I heard my mother say most, "Oh, shit." And I looked at her like, what? She said, "I left the matches down on the washing machine." And she wore stretch pants. You remember stretch pants? They were like leggings, only, they were leggings. But they were stretch pants. And she didn't have any pockets. She said, "I didn't have a pocket, so I left them there. I didn't want to put them up in the wet laundry." It was like her last book of matches or something. And she said, "Would you go downstairs and get it for me?" And I'm like, why don't you get Davey to do that? My brother Dave would do anything. He was like fearless, either that or oblivious. I think he was both. But she said, "He's outside. Would you just go get him?" And the baby was there. And here's my pregnant mother. And I was like her only hope. And I'm not going to say no. And she says, "It's okay. I'm right here. It'll take you 2 minutes." And I asked her, I said, "Are they on the washing machine?" And she said, "Yep, right there. You can't miss them." "I don't have to look around." "No, you won't have to look around." I said, "Okay. All right, I'll do it." So I opened the basement door. I took a deep breath. I girded my loins. And I took a couple steps down the basement. And I was like 3 steps down, still on the steps, my head still basically in the upstairs part of the house. and I noticed the coal bin. And I remembered stories that what my grandmother had told me about the coal bin, because we were always admonished to stay out of there because the walls were still had coal residue all on them, and if we went in there, there was nothing in there. Nothing was stored in there. It was this empty space with coal dust, some coal dust on the floor and on the walls, and my mother, we were never allowed in there because it would make a terrible mess on our bodies and our clothes, and we'd drag it up into the house. But my grandma told us the stories of how the coal man would come with a wagon, and even when they had cars, he still had a horse-drawn wagon that came up the street, and he would holler out that his presence, and people would go out and pay him for as many shovelfuls as they could afford. And then he would take this great big shovel and scoop the shovel out and put it in the coal chute. And my grandma said that their house, when they were younger, that big house was so cool because it had a coal chute on the outside. You didn't have to carry your bucket of coal into the basement. It would just shoot down a chute into the coal bin, so it didn't get the house all dirty and got the world all dirty, but that's another story. But then the coal man would travel back down the road, and she talked about how my dad and his brother, my Uncle Jerry, used to run after the coal wagon because as it went over the street, big chunks of coal would fall out. And coal was precious, you heated your house with coal, and so they'd run up the street, and she said, but your dad and Uncle Jerry would always holler after the coal man and tell him, hey, you dropped some coal, and he would say, keep it, it's yours, because they were so honest. And I always thought that was such a great story, how honest my dad was, and his brother, my Uncle Jerry, and they were amazing little boys. My grandmother told stories about them all the time. So I'm sitting there thinking all this when my mother says, are you going or aren't you going? I'm like, oh, right, okay. So I started down those basement steps, and I'm holding on to that rickety railing, and the minute my feet hit the floor, I knew I wasn't alone. I looked across to my right, and I saw the washing machine probably 10 feet, 12 feet max away from me. Right on top of the washing machine were the matches. And I looked to my left, and there was the wall, and I knew something was right to my left. And I took one, maybe 2 steps in, and I froze. I could feel the presence of something really strong, just right to my left, and I wasn't gonna look. I kept my eyes on those matches, and I started thinking if I could sprint to the matches and then turn and sprint up, I could just grab them quick and not look and run back up those stairs. But then I heard this strange sound. It sounded like well, not like that sound off in the distance, that's Bunce in the background. It sounded like this scraping sound, like a... And I tried to think, what the heck is that? But I wasn't gonna look. I'm still looking at the matches. Plop! And I jumped a foot. And I looked, and there was a brick on the floor next to the wall where there wasn't a brick before. It's like the brick had pushed itself out of the wall. And I stood there, and I could not move. And I'm looking at this, and I'm looking up at the wall where it was when the brick next to it starts pushing out. And I waited no more. I ran up those stairs. I did not get the matches. I ran up those stairs. I jumped into the dining room. My mom was now sitting on the couch or something, or she wasn't right there. I slammed the door. I latched the door, and I stood in the dining room archway, looking at my mother with my eyes probably as big as saucers. And she said, "Did you get the matches?" And I said, "No, they weren't there." And then I said, "I'm going outside." And I went and got my coat and all my stuff on, and I went outside. And when I went out, as I was putting my coat and stuff on, I I just wish so much that I knew I lied to my mother, and I knew that was a sin, and I was going to have to tell the priest when I went to confession on Saturday so that I could take Holy Communion on Sunday. And I knew I was going to have to tell him about Jimmy, too. We told him about that, too. The priest must have thought, what's wrong with these people? But I hoped that God would understand how dire a situation I was in. But more than that, I just really wished that those damn bricks would stay in that wall. Those bricks were always coming out of that wall. When my father would go down there and he'd see the bricks out, he would come upstairs furious. Who's been pulling the bricks out of the wall? He'd say. He'd like yell at us, and we'd all have to stand in a line, and we'd look at each other accusingly, you know, like, I didn't do it. Did you do it? I didn't do it. And invariably someone would blame my brother or something, but nobody ever fessed up. And my father would say, the whole house is going to come down if you keep pulling out the foundation bricks. And then he'd turn his wrath on my mother and yell at her, these kids are doing blah, blah, blah. And it's like, as if she could, But none of us ever seemed to be taking the bricks out, and yet I witnessed none of us taking the bricks out, and still they came out. So I got about 10 minutes. Wonder if I have time for the next one. Should I go short, or should I tell the rest of this part? I guess I'm gonna continue a little bit. If I go a couple minutes over, you won't get too mad at me, I hope. So years later, when after we moved out, my Uncle Gerald and his family moved in, and then when my Uncle Gerald passed away, his family moved out. And when we moved, we took some things, but when they moved, we had to take everything out. And it appeared at our house. So we'd go to school, and I was a teenager by this time, and we'd come home from school, and there'd be new boxes filled with pictures and treasures and all kinds of things. I think of family and just history. And there was one day where there was a trunk. And we would go through the pictures, and they all had, like, on the back of them, it would say who it was and what year it was. And anytime we didn't know what it was, either my mom would know, and if she didn't know, my dad would know. My dad would always tell these great stories about the people whose pictures we found. Well, in this trunk, we went through, and there were these old newspapers. There were newspapers from the start of World War, from Pearl Harbor. There were the front page from Pearl Harbor. There was the front page from before that, there was, and as you went down through the trunk, these yellowed newspapers, it was like a history of America, just layer by layer. You went deeper and deeper into the history of this country until it was like the early 1900s. And then beyond family stuff, we started finding papers and artifacts with the name Davidson on it. And this was not a name that I knew. I knew all of our family names. I knew the Lyons, I knew the Murphys, I knew the Walshes. I knew all those names. So this was not a family member, and we were just curious about who were these Davidsons. And all my father said was they weren't good people, and that's all he knew. So one day, the day that we went through this trunk, down at the bottom, we found a packet of letters. There were maybe a dozen or 15, a dozen or a little bit more letters. And they were all, letters with faded ink, and they were tied up with like a rotting blue ribbon. And, I wanted to be an archaeologist. And so when we got to this, I took it upon myself to carefully open these letters, because they were very fragile. They were very old. And when we opened them, each of the letters was addressed to friend Davidson. And then they were love letters. And like the first ones were just friendly affection. And as they went on, they became more and more affectionate and almost intimate, but not explicitly intimate, but just like you could see this growing relationship through these letters. And for me as a teenager, this was like amazing treasure. And I was looking at each one, and each one was signed fondly, and then just the letter C. And the C had like a curl, and then C. So it was done with a dipped pen or a fountain pen or something. C. And the ink was faded, so it was just gray in these letters. And as I opened them, they had 3 creases. They came out of the envelope in 3 creases, and very carefully, so as not to crumble these letters. And we read them all, and we're like, who is this? Who's Davidson? And who is C? And we said, we got to show Dad this. My mom had no idea what they were. So we kept the letters together and set the ribbon by the side and waited for my dad to get home. And when he got home, he would always have to go change his clothes first and pour a cocktail. While my mom prepared his dinner, and then after he got to settle down and put his feet up on the coffee table, then we could start asking him questions. And so we showed him some pictures that we'd found, and then we showed him the bundle of letters with one open and said, what do you make of these? Who is this? Who are these people? And he did a really strange thing. Usually he knew right away. And this time he held it, and he ran his hand down the letter and then looked off. And he said, see. And he turned to my mother, who had now come in from the kitchen and was snuggled up next to him on the couch. And we were all watching, waiting for some great story. And he said, Jackie, do you remember that dream I had? And my mom said, what dream, Dave? He said, remember, it was in the old house, and I woke you up, and I told you it, and you had to remember. It was about somebody and my mom said, I remember. It was like Karen or Carrie and my dad holds a letter and he says, Kara. And then he told us the dream. And in his dream, he said he saw himself standing in our living room, and it looked like it was when it was our living room. And then he started hearing a voice chanting the name, Kara, Kara, Kara. As the room faded and then reappeared with strange furnishings and with gas lights, as if it had been when it was first built. And he said he saw the whole thing through a tunnel, looking through the bottom of a glass. So he couldn't see anything to the side, but he saw, after this name was repeated, himself through this small scope of vision, walking up those stairs, walking down the hall. There was a wall in front of him where the bathroom door was, turning into the master bedroom, going to the bathroom door in the master bedroom that was not a bathroom, but was a bedchamber. He said he watched himself, he watched from standing at the foot of the bed, and in the bed there was a woman with long black hair, white bed linens, a white nightgown, sleeping in the bed and with her head turned. And then he saw, as if it was himself, go to the side of the bed and lift a big, carving knife and thrust it into the woman, into her chest, again and again. And the blood just spread through all of the bedding until it was crimson. And then he said he felt like there was someone else there, and he and somebody else lifted her lifeless body from the bed and dragged her down the hallway, down the stairs, as her feet thump, 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 on each of the stairs, through the downstairs hall, down the basement stairs, and into the basement where the bricks had been removed from the foundation and a pile of dirt lay next to it with a newly prepared grave. And he said he watched them push her body into this space. And then again, he was up in the living room, hearing the voice calling, Kara, Kara, Kara. And then he woke up. And he woke my mother up. And he looked down at the letter. And he said fondly, see. And he looked up at us and we said, Kara. And we looked at each other and we said, the Slinky Lady. If you heard my earlier story, you'll know about the Slinky Lady. If you haven't, listen to the earlier stories. We stayed up really late that night. It was a school night, and we stayed up late talking about that. We said to my dad, you know, that's where the bricks, he said, that's where the bricks were coming out of the wall. And we all said, that's where the bricks were coming out of the wall. That was her grave. That was where Kara had been disappeared away behind the bricks in that basement wall of that house. And none of us, we all said, none of us ever removed those bricks. None of us ever got near that part of the basement. There was nothing in that part of the basement. It was like, you know, nothing was stored there. The rest of the basement had stuff stored in it, but that one space was open. Nobody went near there. And in his dream, that's where they buried Kara. And we know, we know, that the Slinky Lady that we saw endlessly walking up and down that hallway was Kara, retracing the path that they dragged her body. And now I realize, too, that that man in the closet was probably the man whose eyes my father saw through. So that's my story for tonight. There are more from there. There's more that happened there. There's more that was revealed afterwards. I did learn the story of Kara and the Davidsons, but you'll have to wait for my book for that. It's only a few more weeks till it comes out. Oh my goodness. While I was writing my book, telling these stories from that house, those ghosts came to me and told me their story, and that's what's also in the book. So sometimes the things we're most afraid of, that seem so terrifying, are just hurting. You know, a ferocious, terrifying animal is sometimes just terrified. We're afraid to see each other's pain. We're afraid to feel each other's pain. And so we move away and we close our eyes. But without that, when we do see each other, when we do acknowledge one another's grief and pain, we can help to release it. We can help, not always, but we can let those who are grieving and in pain know that we feel it, we know what they're feeling, and just give them love, you know. The scariest ghosts sometimes need acknowledgement, need love. We all do. Sometimes when I'm the scariest is when I need love the most. How about you? Yeah. So, once again, we come to the end of a Sunday night. Once again, I want to remind you to be kind to one another, and please be kind to yourself. We're all making this up as we go. All of us, our lives. But as we make it up as we go, we've got each other, right? We can gather in circles, put our arms around each other, well, virtually, but we will again. We'll be able to do this again. As long as we take care of each other and stay here, right? I'll see you next week. And meanwhile, have a wonderful week. May good things happen to you. And if not, may you have the grace to get through whatever does happen. Take care. Good night.